At around 2 in the morning on May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson called his parents because his car had gone into a ditch somewhere in rural Minnesota. He wasn't seriously injured, and nothing about the situation initially suggested he was in immediate danger. As far as Brandon knew, all he needed was for his parents to come and pick him up. His parents immediately got into their own car and began searching for him. Brandon stayed on the phone with his father, trying to describe where he was and what he could see around him, while his father drove through the darkness, attempting to locate him. But there was one problem. Brandon didn't actually know where he was. He believed he was somewhere near the small town of Lind, Minnesota, and his parents were searching the area around Lind based on what he had told them. In reality, Brandon was roughly 20 to 25 miles away from where he thought he was, near the town of Taunton. For almost 47 minutes, Brandon remained on the phone with his father as he walked through the darkness, trying to find his way toward what he believed was a nearby town. Then, at approximately 3:10 in the morning, Brandon suddenly said something that would become one of the most haunting details of the entire case. Oh shit. His father never heard from him again. No confirmed sighting followed, and despite years of searches and investigation, Brandon Swanson has never been found. So what happened during those final moments of the phone call? And how could a 19-year-old man disappear in an area that investigators would spend years searching? To understand why Brandon's disappearance is so strange, we first have to go back to the beginning of the night. Brandon Swanson was 19 years old and had just completed his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. On the evening of May 13th, he had been spending time with friends before eventually getting into a Chevrolet Lumina and driving home. There was nothing particularly unusual about that decision. He was a college student returning home after spending the evening with friends, and sometime during the early hours of May 14th, he was driving through the rural countryside of southwestern Minnesota. The roads in this part of the state can be extremely isolated, particularly during the middle of the night. Long stretches of farmland are separated by gravel roads, small towns, rivers, and drainage ditches. Once the sun goes down, it can become surprisingly difficult for someone unfamiliar with the area to determine exactly where they are. At some point during the drive, Brandon's car left the roadway and became stuck in a ditch. Fortunately, Brandon appeared to be uninjured. He had his cell phone, he was able to get out of the vehicle, and he could still communicate with his parents. So he did what most people in his situation would probably have done. He called home. His parents answered and immediately began trying to figure out where he was. Brandon gave them the information he had, and they started driving toward the location where they believed they could find him. At first, this seemed like it would be a relatively simple rescue. His car was stuck, his parents knew he needed help, and Brandon was talking to them on the phone. There was no reason to believe that this night would become a mystery that lasted for decades. But the first major problem was already there. Brandon had no accurate idea of where he actually was. Brandon believed he was near Lind, Minnesota. His parents therefore began searching around Lind, expecting that their son would be somewhere nearby. Brandon, meanwhile, was trying to determine where he was by looking at the landscape around him and identifying lights in the distance. The problem was that the lights he could see weren't necessarily where he thought they were. In the darkness, a small town several miles away can look deceptively close. A road can appear to lead toward a familiar location when it actually takes you in the opposite direction, and landmarks that would be obvious during the day can become almost meaningless when everything around you is reduced to silhouettes. Eventually, Brandon decided that he wasn't going to wait beside his car. He would walk. His father remained on the phone with him, and the two of them began trying to work out where Brandon could be based on what he was seeing. Brandon described the area around him and continued moving through the countryside while his father searched for him. For the next several dozen minutes, they remained connected by phone, with his father essentially trying to navigate his son toward safety from miles away. But there was an enormous problem. Neither of them realized how far apart they actually were. Brandon thought he was close to Lind, while his parents were searching in that area. In reality, he was near Taunton, far from where they expected him to be. This mistake would become one of the most important details in the entire investigation. While Brandon was walking through the countryside, his parents were driving around looking for someone who wasn't there, and neither side knew that the search was happening in the wrong place. There is something particularly unusual about Brandon's disappearance that separates it from many other missing person cases. We know what he was doing immediately before he disappeared. We know because his father was listening to him. For approximately 47 minutes, Brandon remained on the phone while he walked through the countryside. His father could hear him speaking and knew that his son was alive and moving. That means investigators weren't trying to reconstruct Brandon's final hour entirely from witnesses who had seen him earlier in the evening. They had something much more valuable. They had a conversation. Brandon reportedly described crossing fences and moving through fields, and at one point he mentioned hearing water nearby. He was still attempting to find his way toward what he believed were the lights of Lind. From Brandon's perspective, the situation may not have seemed particularly dangerous. His parents were looking for him. He was talking to his father. He believed he was close to a town, and he probably expected that the entire ordeal would be over soon. But from his father's perspective, the situation was becoming increasingly frustrating. He couldn't see Brandon. He couldn't determine exactly where his son was. And every attempt to locate him depended on Brandon's descriptions of a landscape that Brandon himself didn't fully understand. The two men were essentially trying to solve a geographical puzzle in real time, in complete darkness, with neither of them having the complete picture. And somewhere during those 47 minutes, Brandon moved farther away from the place where his parents were searching. To understand what might have happened next, it helps to understand the environment Brandon was walking through. This wasn't a crowded city where there would have been street lights, businesses, and people everywhere. It was rural Minnesota. There were fields, gravel roads, fences, and waterways spread across a large area of countryside. At night, many of those features would have been almost impossible to distinguish from one another unless you were already familiar with the area. Brandon was also apparently trying to take shortcuts through fields rather than simply remaining on established roads. During daylight, that might not have been particularly dangerous. But at 2 or 3 in the morning, walking through unfamiliar farmland becomes a completely different situation. A fence can suddenly appear in front of you. A ditch can be hidden by darkness. A river or drainage channel can become difficult to see until you're already standing beside it. And if someone is already confused about their location, every decision they make has the potential to take them farther away from where they believe they are. At some point during the call, Brandon reportedly mentioned hearing water. That detail would become particularly significant because the Yellow Medicine River was located in the area where his car had been found. Investigators would eventually spend considerable time searching waterways and surrounding areas for evidence that Brandon might have fallen into the river. But at the time of the phone call, neither Brandon nor his father knew exactly how close he might have been to the water. They were still trying to find each other. And then came the final moment. At approximately 3:10 a.m., after nearly 47 minutes of conversation, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit." Those two words are perhaps the most famous part of his disappearance, but they're also one of the easiest details to misunderstand. We don't actually know what Brandon saw. We don't know what he was reacting to, and we don't know whether whatever caused him to speak was dangerous, frightening, or simply unexpected. He might have slipped. He might have encountered water. He might have fallen into a ditch or encountered some other obstacle in the darkness. He might have seen an animal. He might have encountered another person, or something else entirely could have happened. The words themselves don't tell us. What we do know is that immediately afterward, Brandon stopped responding to his father. His father tried to communicate with him, but there was no answer. The phone call ended. His parents continued trying to reach him, but Brandon did not respond. A conversation that had continued for nearly an hour had suddenly turned into silence. And that silence would last much longer than anyone could have imagined. As the search continued, investigators were eventually able to determine that Brandon had not been anywhere near the location his parents originally believed. His Chevrolet Lumina was found in a ditch near Taunton, Minnesota, on Lincoln Lyon Road. The vehicle provided investigators with an important starting point, but it didn't provide them with Brandon. The FBI's VICAP missing person alert states that the car was found abandoned in a ditch with its doors open and the keys missing. Brandon himself was nowhere to be found. The discovery created another important question. Why had Brandon left his vehicle? The most straightforward answer is also the least mysterious. He believed he was close enough to walk for help. He was talking to his parents, and he probably thought that getting out of the car and walking toward the lights he could see would allow him to meet them sooner. There is nothing inherently suspicious about that decision. But because Brandon was mistaken about his location, leaving the vehicle may have made the situation much worse. The car was a fixed point. Once investigators found it, they knew exactly where Brandon had been. But Brandon had already walked away from that point. And because he believed he was somewhere else, he may have been moving according to a completely inaccurate mental map of the area. Once investigators realized the scale of the problem, a major search effort began. Searchers examined roads, fields, waterways, and surrounding areas, looking for anything that might indicate where Brandon had gone after leaving his vehicle. The Yellow Medicine River became one of the areas of interest. If Brandon had accidentally fallen into the river, it could potentially explain why he had vanished without leaving an obvious trail. He had mentioned hearing water. He was walking through unfamiliar terrain at night, and a river was located relatively close to the area where his vehicle had been found. It was a plausible explanation, but there was a problem. Searches didn't find Brandon. According to reporting from the Marshall Independent, investigators eventually searched a huge portion of the watershed, covering roughly 120 square miles at one point. Despite those efforts, no conclusive evidence was found that established what happened to Brandon. This doesn't necessarily eliminate the possibility of an accidental drowning. Bodies can be extremely difficult to recover from rivers, particularly when water conditions, vegetation, underwater structures, and the passage of time are involved. But after so many years, the absence of definitive evidence has left the case unresolved. And that's where the mystery begins to expand. Because if Brandon didn't drown, where did he go? The most straightforward possibility is that Brandon suffered an accident. He was lost. He was walking through unfamiliar countryside in the middle of the night. He was potentially near a river, and his final known words could have been a reaction to something that suddenly happened to him. Perhaps he slipped, perhaps he fell, perhaps he entered the water, perhaps he became injured somewhere investigators never managed to locate. There is nothing impossible about this explanation. In fact, it may be the simplest explanation for the case. But simple doesn't necessarily mean proven. No one has established that Brandon entered the river. No one has recovered his remains, and no definitive physical evidence has been found that tells investigators where he went after that phone call. So the accident theory remains possible. It simply doesn't answer every question. Another possibility is that Brandon became severely disoriented. This may sound less dramatic than the idea of foul play, but it is worth taking seriously. Brandon believed he was near Lind when he was actually near Taunton, meaning his understanding of his own location was already significantly wrong. If he continued walking while relying on distant lights as landmarks, he could have moved much farther from his car than anyone realized. And once he became separated from the roads and entered fields, it would have become increasingly difficult for searchers to predict where he might have gone. Imagine walking through the countryside at 3 in the morning while believing you're only a few miles from home. You see lights in the distance. You assume they're coming from the town you're looking for, so you walk toward them. But the lights aren't where you think they are. You keep walking, and with every step, You're unknowingly moving farther away from the people searching for you. That scenario doesn't require anything supernatural or criminal. It only requires one person to become lost in the dark. But it still leaves us with the same problem. Where did he ultimately go? The possibility of foul play is naturally one of the more disturbing theories surrounding the case. If Brandon encountered another person after leaving his car, then the 47-minute phone call becomes even more significant. His father was essentially listening to his son in real time. If another person approached Brandon, would Brandon have noticed? Would he have said something? Could the encounter have happened suddenly enough that he didn't have time to explain what was happening? We don't know. And there is no publicly established evidence proving that another person abducted or killed Brandon. That distinction matters. An unsolved disappearance does not automatically mean that foul play occurred. It simply means investigators have been unable to establish what happened. Still, the possibility cannot simply be dismissed because the case remains unresolved. There is a difference between saying, "Someone must have taken him," and saying, "We cannot completely rule out the possibility that another person was involved." The first is speculation presented as fact. The second is an acknowledgement of uncertainty. And Brandon's case is full of uncertainty. This brings us back to the most famous moment in the case. "Oh shit." Those words have been repeated countless times because they are the final known words from Brandon before his disappearance. But there is an uncomfortable possibility that the answer may be far less dramatic than people imagine. Perhaps Brandon saw the river. Perhaps he realized he was in a completely different place than he thought. Perhaps he slipped. Perhaps he saw an animal. Perhaps he simply encountered something unexpected while walking through the darkness. The human brain naturally wants to fill in missing information. When someone says, "Oh shit," and then disappears, our imagination immediately wants to know what they saw. But the phrase itself is not evidence of what happened. It is only evidence that Brandon experienced something unexpected at that moment. And that distinction is important because the mystery becomes much more interesting when we separate what we know from what we imagine. What we know is remarkably limited. Brandon was alive. He was walking. He was on the phone. He was somewhere near Taunton. He mentioned his surroundings. Then he reacted to something. And after that, nothing. Brandon's disappearance wasn't forgotten after the initial search. His family continued searching for answers, and investigators continued to classify him as a missing person. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension still lists Brandon Swanson in its unsolved missing person database. The official case information identifies him as having disappeared on May 14, 2008, when he was 19 years old. More than 18 years later, there is still no confirmed location for him. And the case has had an impact beyond Brandon's own family. His disappearance became associated with changes to Minnesota's missing person procedures, eventually contributing to legislation commonly known as Brandon's Law. The basic principle behind those changes was simple. When someone disappears, the first hours can be critical. Families shouldn't necessarily have to wait before reporting someone missing. Brandon's case became part of the reason that principle gained greater recognition in Minnesota. But legislation can't answer the question his family has been living with since 2008. Where is Brandon? At approximately 3 a.m. on May 14, 2008, Brandon Swanson was walking through the darkness of rural Minnesota while talking to his father. His parents were trying to find him, and Brandon believed he was somewhere near Lind. But he was actually miles away, near Taunton, and the people searching for him didn't know that yet. For almost an hour, his father could hear his son's voice. Then Brandon suddenly said, "Oh shit," and the phone went silent. His car was eventually found. Investigators followed leads and considered different explanations, but Brandon himself was never found. Maybe something happened to him that night that investigators have never been able to uncover. We simply don't know. And that's what makes this case different from a mystery where the evidence points strongly toward one explanation. Here, the final known moments are almost within reach. We can hear Brandon's voice in the story. We know he was alive. We know approximately when everything stopped. But the one thing we don't know is what happened in the few seconds between those final words and the silence that followed. More than 18 years later, Brandon Swanson remains missing. And somewhere between the ditch where his car was found and the final words spoken over that phone call lies the answer to one of America's most haunting disappearances. The question is whether that answer will ever be found.